When we talk about destroying sleep architecture, alcohol is really one of the bad actors that is implicated. If we're trying to protect our sleep, there are very few things I can think of that are more harmful than alcohol. And so we just have to be thoughtful about using alcohol, how much we're consuming, and over weeks, months, or years, cumulatively, that can have a pretty harmful effect.
Welcome to this week's Escape Your Limits podcast, where I speak to a Harvard-trained doctor who went on to become a Navy flight surgeon before becoming the CTO of Boeing Aerospace. Now he's the president and CMO of Wave Neuroscience, a company dedicated to creating a world where every individual, regardless of status, can improve their mind. His team at Wave Neuroscience are the world-leading experts in brain health, PTSD, depression, anxiety, and they're now getting approached by business leaders and athletes looking to get a competitive edge by improving their mental performance. The tech they've pioneered involves using computational analytics to solve problems that have never been tackled before in the mental health space. And they're doing it non-invasively with no medications of any kind. Based on my knowledge of the health and wellness sector and how the success of any wellness program is totally reliant on what is happening between your ears, I think this is a very exciting subject to explore. So please enjoy this week's episode with the President and Chief Medical Officer of Wave Neuroscience, Dr. Erik Won.
So Dr. Erik Won, thank you for inviting me here to your wonderful location. This is pretty impressive.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I'm honored to spend time with you today.
And it's like for people who are listening on the audio, we're in a place called Cardiff, which is not Cardiff in England. It's Cardiff in San Diego County, and we're overlooking just behind me. We've got a beautiful view of the ocean, and I've just had a brain scan. So I'm fascinated, really. What got you into this field? Because I suppose, from what I understood, you were originally planning to be a priest. Is that correct?
Yeah. So, yeah, it's funny to reflect back. But when I was transitioning from high school to college, I went to the University of Notre Dame, and part of my interest was consideration of being a priest. And I realized that that may not be my calling, and sort of transitioned and pursued a career in medicine. And now I'm happily married with 5 children. And so definitely moved in a different direction, but we tried to raise our kids within the tradition of the church. So that's still become a part of my life. But getting into this field of neuroscience and neuromodulation, I should probably mention, my background. More than 20 years ago, I was a Navy flight surgeon, and my unit had the unfortunate distinction of having some of the first casualties of Operation Iraqi Freedom. And as a byproduct, I had some very close friends who were struggling with the signature injuries of that conflict, post-traumatic stress and traumatic brain injury. And so I was always looking for something to help. And when I left the service, I finished up my medical training at the Harvard hospitals, Mass General and Brigham and Women's, and ended up at the Boeing company and kind of discovered this technology by accident. And I had a pilot and a crew chief who came through, and their transformation really sort of defied traditional medicine. And I realized that this may be an inflection point in the way we're able to treat and address some of these conditions that have been very challenging. So that was kind of the discovery. At the time, I was playing a couple roles at the Boeing company. I was chief physician and chief technology officer. I was very happy there, but realized the opportunity here to impact so many more lives was very compelling to me.
So how do you define what it is you actually do?
Yeah, so our objective is to really impact people with neurocognitive health conditions in a profoundly positive way. And a lot of the way we're doing that is by translating the work from neuroscience labs and academic centers around the world into technologies that are accessible and available to the communities. And our approach is really a 3-step process. The first is getting an EEG, or an electroencephalogram, Much in the same way an electrocardiogram is an electrophysiologic picture of the heart, we capture electrophysiologic pictures of the brain. And you got to experience this earlier this morning. But we take that information and that data, and the second step is we run it through computational analytics and generate a report that can identify areas that may not be functioning as well as they could. And then our third step is to perform what's called neuromodulation. We use two different tools. One is an FDA approved product called transcranial magnetic stimulation, but we're personalizing it to each individual using these brain maps, these EEGs. And that's really our core expertise, is a customization of protocol to each individual and honoring our diversity as a species in a manner that will provide the most effective treatment possible. And to give you a high-level illustration of that, we all have a dominant alpha frequency, which is the intrinsic rate with which we process information. Most of the population is going to be between 8 and 13 hertz, which means we encode information 8 to 13 times per second. But if we find areas of the brain that may be misfiring, we might see clusters of neurons that are firing, let's just say at 6 hertz. And if we see that the dominant wavelength is supposed to be at 11, we can point to that and say, let's work together to improve that area of the brain. And so we'll provide stimulation at the dominant frequency, in this case 11 hertz. If somebody's misfiring at 6, if it's the prefrontal cortex, this area of the brain that's responsible for executive function, it might manifest as depression. And so somebody may feel lethargic, not wanting to get out of bed, and lack motivation. And as we provide the treatment, we start to see those communication pathways, those neural networks start to normalize. And then we see the symptoms improve over time. In a different scenario, where we may see, let's say, the right backhand side of the brain misfiring at 30 hertz. This is where the visual cortex is. If you're oversampling your environment 30 times per second, but only able to process it 11 times per second, the information overload may manifest as anxiety. And so these brain maps give us an awful lot of information that allow us to have these important conversations with patients and clients, and importantly, work together to try to improve their function. And that's ultimately our goal.
And from a performance perspective, we were chatting about this earlier, and performance optimization. You were mentioning that you're working with people like people who are driving sports cars and UFC fighters and jet fighters. So part of, for people who are listening and thinking, well, how does this apply? Well, how would you apply this? It's actually your brain health is affecting how you perform, whether you're an executive or whether you're doing a sport, or it has a lot of impact on your mental performance. Is that correct?
That's exactly right and spot on. It's interesting. Our roots were in medicine and clinical trials, but one of my first visits to the U.S. Special Operations Command, I had a 2-star general pull me aside and say, I love what you're doing for our men and women. Can you help healthy people to be better on target? And so it was this initial conversation about human performance and neurooptimization. 5 years ago, I actually didn't know the answer to that question, but we've done lots of data collection and research, and it appears the answer is yes, we can help in some important ways. And one of the metrics that we've seen could be improved, we talked about earlier, were changes in reaction time and HRV. And that's something that's gained a lot of interest in this human performance, athletic trainer, fitness industry. And it's
HRV as well.
Yeah.
So how does your brain link to, because and I may be wrong in understanding, but so we were talking about these aura rings, and one of the measurements is your HRV, and the higher your HRV, the better your recovery. And so is there a connection between what happens to your brain and what happens in your heart then?
Yeah, the brain, we can think of it as a CPU of the body, and there's so many downrange benefits when brain function starts to improve, and as an engine, it starts to operate more efficiently. We've been observing that there are a number of different areas that improve, in some cases unexpectedly. And so HRV, it's interesting, we got an unsolicited call from somebody at Whoop, we actually acquired about a dozen devices to track people's sleep quality. And we've noticed in a lot of our patients, the feedback we got was, I'm getting the best sleep I've had in years. And so we wanted to use these Whoop devices to, and for those who are not familiar, these Whoops are wearables. They're on your wrist, and they're measuring a number of different biometrics, heart rate variability, and sleep. We were interested in the sleep component, but this unsolicited call from one of the Whoop reps was telling us that we're seeing big changes in HRV in your patient population. And so we very quickly worked to get smart on what HRV was, and we've learned that it's really a proxy for emotional resilience, but it has a lot of applications to the athletic world as well. And so that's something that's gained a lot of interest. We're embarking upon some work with the Air Force to look at that a bit more closely. And so that'll be interesting. One of the partners in that initiative is Oura Ring, and so we're going to capture data through these wearables. And I think in a year or two, we're going to have much richer and granular data with which to look at how that's impacted.
So do you think that that's a side effect of you improving how your brain's firing, which improves your sleep, which in turn improves your HRV, or is there almost like a direct connection in some way, or do you not know at the moment?
I think we're still learning. We've had some people mention this is sort of the dynamic with what many people would call flow state. For us, really, we're trying to optimize brain function, make it work more efficiently as an organ. There is an intrinsic relationship between the heart and the brain as the two electrical organs in the body. My intuition is that improved sleep quality has a lot to do with the changes in HRV. One of our initial studies, we did pre and post-treatment assessments using something called the Pittsburgh Sleep Quality Index, or the PSQI. And we found a significant separation between our placebo group and our treatment group in terms of the sleep quality that was being measured. And so we've since then gotten some in-lab polysomnograms, and we've seen that with the treatment, people are getting higher quality sleep in terms of sleep architecture, meaning they're getting more REM sleep and slow wave sleep, stage 3 sleep. And as a byproduct, we're seeing improvements in HRV. So I think there is this whole ecosystem that changes when we can improve significantly one area. There's a lot of downrange benefit that we're starting to observe as well.
And you mentioned that so you said the brain, because your colleague took me through and we did this brain scan, and he said what that's doing, that's measuring electrical activities essentially. Was that correct?
Correct. Yeah.
And then the heart is also an electrical. It's a similar type of organ, like an electrical organ. Is that right? Am I in some way?
It is, yeah. So there's kind of two nodes or two generators within the heart. It's called the sinoatrial node, the atrioventricular node, and so these are what create impulses with which your heart can beat. The brain has its own oscillator generators. But there's a relationship between the two that's an area of very intense study right now. And so I think we're still learning how all those relationships are intertwined. But we've certainly observed as we improve brain function, there are these changes in HRV. And I think one doesn't necessarily improve without the other. Somebody has to be taking care of their own physical fitness to, I think, really optimize those gains. But as one might expect, all these systems are interrelated, and those relationships, I think, we're just starting to learn how that all plays together.
It's fascinating. Do you have, without using science, and I know you're a doctor, and with what you're saying here, you've got to follow the science, but do you have any, if you were to sort of make your own like unqualified connections, because for me it's fascinating, like how the heart and the brain, or if the heart and the brain have any kind of connections, and if they're like they have very different functions. But do you feel that there is also that some sort of direct correlation between how one can affect the other directly?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that relationship is becoming pretty well established. To give you kind of a physiologic basis, your brain is 2% of your body weight, but it's 20% of your caloric consumption or your energy consumption.
How much? What percent?
20%.
20%. Wow.
Yeah, so it's a very kind of energy hungry organ with a pretty large demand. And so if we can improve the efficiency of the organ, you can almost think of it, it's an imperfect analogy, but the efficiency of an engine in a car. You know, if it no longer has that kind of energy and oxygen requirement, the demand from the heart also improves. And so all these things sort of work very closely together. It's more classically medicine, we talk about the relationship between heart and lungs because there are very well-established feedback loops in terms of oxygen debt and then cardiac demand and cardiac output. And we're starting to see that the neurologic system is connected in the same way. And so it's, I think, a constantly evolving science, and we're probably have only uncovered maybe a couple % of what there is to learn about the brain. We're talking earlier, we're learning, it seems daily and weekly, there are new studies and discoveries that are happening where it may change the way that we think about things. But there's clearly new science to show this relationship, and I think in the next decade there'll be a lot of innovation and discovery around that.
Do you think it's because it's a difficult thing to observe and study? Like, I guess I was watching a video when I was preparing for this, and they were talking about, if anything happens in your body, you go to a doctor outside of the brain as you go, and you have some sort of scan, and you'll kind of cut it open, you'll look at it, and you'll either cut it out or you'll see what's happening. But the first thing you kind of do is you'll have a look at what's going on in most cases. But with the brain, we talked about, if somebody's got some sort of issues or challenges or post-traumatic stress and that, like, historically, you're not looking at the brain and say, oh yeah, that's what's going on there. Or, a lot of it's done through therapy without necessarily observation. Is that just because some of the tools to accurately observe or understand what you're observing is only recently become available?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. A lot of the classic training in medicine has been systems-based. And so you have dedicated cardiologists, you have dedicated neurologists, and even in the area of neuroscience, there's so much diversity in background and training and research that it's hard to find sort of multidisciplinary approaches and multidisciplinary thinking, how all these symptoms integrate and work together. Just to give you a sense of the depth and breadth of neuroscience, there are labs who spend careers studying the action potentials that are triggered by a hair moving, right? And so there are labs who are studying level 2 pyramidal cells, a specific layer within the brain with which there's a lot of arborization where the neural branches between different neurons connect. And so we're specifically focused in an area of neuroscience that we call oscillatory neuroscience, where the different areas of the brain and these neurons, they propagate and they send messages, and how all those neurons work cohesively as a system. This is the foundational work of Yuri Buzaki, and Leslie Pritchett is a lady that we're working with very closely now. And so how even this world of neuroscience, these different areas of research work together is an area that I think we're just starting to scratch the surface. And so it's both an exciting time, but one with which there has to be an acknowledgement of how much we don't know before we can really embark upon some of the heavy lifting and work that needs to be done. So it's both an exciting time in terms of the applications that can be utilized to improve lives right now in the current day, but also how we strategically move towards new emerging science down the road.
Introducing the next big thing in functional training, the Escape Barrow, a revolutionary training tool that combines a loaded farmer's carry with a sled push to develop hip, grip, and core strength. Developed in partnership with Pete Holman, inventor of the TRX Rip Trainer and Nautilus Glute Drive, the Escape Barrow can be rolled, pushed, dragged and carried. The Escape Barrow packs a punch with an impressive load capacity of 440 pounds, and with a 2-stage galvanized paint covering process, it's also ideal for outdoor use. So head over to escapefitness.com/barrow. That's escapefitness.com/barrow to find out more. Enjoy the rest of this episode.
So when you do the brain map or scan, and this is another thing I was reading about, or I ended up going down a sort of bit of a YouTube rabbit hole, and from what I understand, and maybe you can explain the differences, but there's different types of scans. So you've got these PET scans and FRMIs and EEGs, and you do a ECG scan. Is that correct?
EEG.
EEG. Yeah. Okay. So for my benefit, like what are the different types of scans, and why is the scan that you do, is it more related to the type of treatment that you're prescribing afterwards, or is there, do they all play a different part for different reasons?
Yeah, they're all. So neuroimaging has evolved very rapidly as well, and each of these tools have very powerful applications in terms of examining, for example, anatomy with MRI. MRIs are incredibly sophisticated tools and have very good resolution in terms of identifying areas where you might find a bleed or some kind of solid mass or tumor. And that's an area where the resolution of those images have gotten better over time. Functional MRI has added a layer to that where you can add a time domain. PET scans, they're looking at a form of metabolic activity. There's also these neurovascular studies that we can get. EEG is specifically looking at the electrical conductivity in the different areas of the brain. It's what we call a functional image. And what makes it a little bit different than, let's say, a CT scan or an MRI that are still images that are taken as a single snapshot in time is the time domain of an EEG. It's almost like a video. And so we can look at neural pathways in real time, see how the brain reacts to certain stimuli. While we're doing eyes closed resting EEG, there's a whole other area of neuroscience where they're doing eyes open, evoked potential EEGs, where they're providing a stimulus or they're having you relive experiences and looking at how the brain responds to that. And that's a very dynamic process where even you and I looking at something similar may have very different brain patterns that occur based on our experiences. And so I think where the industry is heading now that we have these digital images and we're entering this digital era of brain health, we can now start incorporating a lot of machine learning and artificial intelligence to make sense of what's incredibly complex neuroscience. And we're having some of those conversations now. But that's part of, I think, why it's an exciting time to be in the space, is that this used to be quite mysterious, and we didn't really have even a mechanism with which to have some of these thoughtful discussions. But now, whether it's through kind of programmed heuristics or machine learning, I think we're going to start to find out patterns in relation to neural networks and brain function that we couldn't have even dreamed of a decade or two ago.
We were chatting a little while ago about the health and fitness industry, and I was telling you about a lot of the people that I've interviewed, whether they're trainers, training athletes, celebrities, people that are overweight. One of the things that always comes back in terms of how these diets or workouts are successful is that they have to start with working with the people's heads or brains, whatever you want to call it. They need to get them mentally engaged into what they're doing, because if they don't do that, then no matter what else happens, they're not going to be successful. And from when I was listening to a little bit about what you said, people that have maybe had accidents or bumps or things that have happened maybe a long time in their life may cause their brain patterns to not be firing in exactly the correct way. They might not be like this cohesiveness that you spoke about, which can lead to people being, depressed and not knowing about it, or just having different kind of episodes. And I suppose that if you are going through some sort of irregularity in your brain that you may not necessarily know, then trying to focus on something which you mentioned that I have, or change charts, or do all these sort of daily tasks that may be sort of interrupted, and you may not know what it is, but it may prevent you from going on and doing, whether it's exercise or whether it's doing a particular role like you talked about, your family, for example. So do you think in terms of what we've got here, if you think about general health and wellness in general, do you feel that if you want to be healthy and eat well and exercise and sleep well, which is part of a healthy life, that it could be really important to say, well, look, have your brain scanned, just make sure that everything is correct and in order. If not, maybe there's a little bit of optimization needed, and then build that into, your gym and your nutritionalist and everything else. Do you feel that those are all kind of interconnected now?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it's really a critical piece, and this is really, I think, your area of expertise, and this has been an area where I think we've been learning. And if we talk about sort of these three pillars of, physical training and being smart about it, diet and nutrition being another pillar, and then recovery as being the third. Our technology and our approach, I think, is squarely in this recovery space, particularly if we're able to impart higher quality, more restorative sleep. And that has so many downrange benefits. And just to touch a little bit on it, we've talked about some of the discipline and focus required to maintain healthy habits, and keeping the diligence to go into the gym and do your workouts, but also to make smart food choices. And I just think about one of these areas of sleep that's really interesting is there ends up being a bit of a cascade that happens when you have consecutive nights of poor quality sleep and you're underslept. There are two hunger hormones, ghrelin and leptin, that can become a bit imbalanced. And ghrelin is our hunger hormone, leptin is the one that makes us feel satiated and full. And even with just a few nights of poor sleep, we can't see increases in the amount of ghrelin, and it makes it hard for people to make those smart food choices. And so that ends up being its own kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. And if we can break that chain by getting people higher quality sleep, a lot of it, I think, takes care of itself. Nobody sets out the day thinking, I want to fail at this, right? It's mostly about having good habits and having those fundamental building blocks that will allow them to succeed. And I think that's part of the discussion that we're involved in is how do we set people up for the best possible success, and sleep being sort of foundational to all of this.
And and this is there's probably a couple of sides of looking at it. Do you find that if let's come up with a scenario. Let's say somebody has, we talked earlier about soccer, as they call it in America, or football, as we do in England, and you're tracking people that are, kids are playing football and potentially disrupting things by, heading the ball over a period. So say, for example, somebody does that a lot as a kid, and that that there's been some kind of slight trauma as a result of that. Could that in itself affect your quality of sleep later life because of some sort of trauma caused by that then?
Yeah, unfortunately that is something that we see quite often is if we see disruptions in brain activity early in the developmental cycle, that can have kind of longer range impact, so to speak. Now there's pluses and minuses as if this happens earlier in life, there's a lot more neuroplasticity, and we see a lot of those people recover quite nicely. But if we see people who are a little bit older who may have sustained injuries, that can manifest in a number of different ways. One of the issues related to not just traumatic brain injury, but persistent post-concussion symptoms, it's multifactorial, but we see both sleep disruption, but neuroendocrine disruption as well.
What does that mean?
So neuroendocrine disruption refers to changes in hormone balance. And so a lot of that cascade, what we call the HPA axis, the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis, starts in the brain. And if there is some type of injury that may impact that axis, we can see shifts in testosterone and some of the other kind of hormones that are fundamental to our biology and our existence. There's some beautiful studies that were done with the military where the number of deployments people do was becoming associated with deficiencies in testosterone level. And so there's now, I think only now becoming real recognition of that. And I think if we're talking about the causal mechanisms, there's still some learning to do. Is it a result of chronic sleep deprivation? Is it injury sustained overseas? We think about some of the environment that these operators are exposed to. They're staying up late at night because they have night vision goggles, they have a tactical advantage, they're trying to sleep during the day. It's almost a perfect prescription for a sleep deprivation type scenario. And certainly we see that in our population as well. Many people who have not been in a highly kinetic environment or a combat environment, but are just chronically underslept. We see patterns that look like brain injury. And so, the brain, our biology doesn't necessarily care what the mechanism of injury is. It responds to these injuries in similar ways. And one of those ways is to slow down. And that's part of, I think, the science that's evolving. We're starting to learn a bit more about how the different mechanisms may yield changes in neuronal activity and brain function.
How would you know about that then? Because it sounds like that I could be a person going to my doctor or a gym and or my trainer or physiotherapist or whatever, and it's like, okay, look, I'm struggling with this or with that, and like without doing a brain scan, then would it be difficult to identify? Because I suppose you're looking at the effects of things that you may put down to, well, there could be a number of different reasons that you could put it down to. If you had low testosterone, or if you had trouble keeping weight off, or if you had trouble with performance, there could be so many. If you're looking at causes, there could be so many potential options. But I suppose without a brain scan, would it be quite difficult then to truly pinpoint exactly what may be causing that? Would you say?
It can be difficult. Historically, this has been sort of, asking the right questions, there being awareness and education around the types of factors that can lead to deterioration of function, whether it's concussions and head injuries, chronic sleep deprivation. Many people can get involved in motor vehicle accidents. There's sometimes difficult conversations to have. But I think more and more, as awareness increases, we can have those conversations. We think the brain imaging is an important part of that discussion. And the more we can get these at specified intervals, we may be able to capture a bit more. Whether it's preseason for an athletic team, somebody sustains an injury, we'd be able to see very clearly what that injury looks like. It can be in military units. We're talking a lot to firefighters and police officers, law enforcement, about getting EEGs so that we can make informed decisions in the future. But even for physical trainers and physiotherapists, I think it's interesting to see if we start to measure what these changes are with things that we implement, whether it's a new exercise regimen, some new movements, incorporating cryotherapy or red light therapy, some of these other modalities involved in recovery, seeing how they might impact brain function with a simple 15-minute study seems to make a lot of sense. And so I think in the future, we're going to start seeing more incorporation of this kind of technology into this realm of fitness, particularly as it relates to the brain-body connection.
When you were looking at my scans, you noticed a few things that weren't quite there, and I'm going to try and look at that and maybe get my score up. But is there anything that you've done or studied in terms of scanning someone's brain before, let's say, they do certain types of? I'm aware that there's certain types of kind of motor neuron training that you can do to improve your reaction and speed and things. So are you able to track if you had someone that probably hadn't worked out and they probably weren't eating or sleeping, and your colleague told me about alcohol as well, how that can kind of leave some sort of scarring or effect on the brain, and then scanning someone after they've been through like a healthy period, do you notice a difference in the kind of how healthy that brain looks after doing things like that?
Yeah, so we can certainly see changes in terms of alpha coherence, and we've tried to innovate, and we think pretty successfully, this brain score concept, where to make things really simple, we'll score somebody 0 to 100, and if they do implement some type of positive change, whether it's being more focused on their sleep, changing their diet, or having a more dedicated physical regimen, we can see changes in those scores. But the elements that we like to see are improvements in alpha density, the amount of neurons that are firing at they're within the default mode network, or improvements in coherence, the alignment of these different neurons. And so there's a number of different dimensions we can focus on to see, are these changes having an impact in cognitive function, or are the benefits somewhere else?
And if they do have an impact on cognitive function and you're getting more activity, my guess then is that's going to be like almost like an ongoing loop, that you're probably going to be better prepared and stronger to continue to be. Is it like this kind of like flywheel effect? Once you kind of get it going, that you're more likely to be, everything's likely to kind of get come together, and your life's going to be better, would you say?
That's exactly right, and that's our hope. And so just to share one story, we had a Air Force Special Operations operator come in, and in his neurocognitive assessments, he was 2 standard deviations above the norm for everything except for processing speed. And so to most of the world, he looked like an amazing individual who was performing at the top of his class in just about everything. But internally, he felt like something was wrong. And so we were able to treat him. We went through a course of treatment, and he improved quite dramatically. It's been 4 years now, and we got to do a repeat EEG on him, and we saw massive improvements. And his feedback to us was, once I was able to think more clearly and get better sleep, he could then engage all these positive behaviors, and it kind of just became its own momentum. And so that is the hope. And I don't want to misrepresent this. It's not a panacea. This is not, all of a sudden rainbows and unicorns everywhere. It does require the discipline and the work and the effort to make all that happen. But it's one of those fundamental building blocks where when you are able to get more focus and attention, and ideally higher quality sleep, all these other things tend to fall in line, or at least it's giving you the opportunity to impact yourself in that way.
I suppose it's just having the awareness we can go back to my one, but you said, look, there's definitely something here which could be either a trauma or it could be sleep, and and I guess probably the same thing, but it certainly, knowing my lifestyle, it was a sleep thing, and that was at my age, it's like a bit of a concern. I'm not, and also I'm quite competitive, so I want to get the best score I can. And I suppose unrecognized, I could potentially just continue with that. I'm healthy, I'm fit in my body, but obviously that's only one small part of it. And what I don't want to do is have dementia, be able to live and have a great body, but then you lose your marbles, which I guess can happen as a result of bad sleep and that sort of stuff. So I suppose that having that conscious awareness of where you are, and then being able to at least have an opportunity to do something about it. Because if you don't know, you don't know, do you? You know, that's
Yeah, it can be a powerful behavior modifier.
right. Yeah, that's
Right.
probably a better way of saying it.
And so many times,
Even like this, you know, like the ring, it's more of a behavior modifier, isn't it?
yeah, and so it's a great illustration. And I think many times, if we just thinking for myself, if I get a bad night of sleep, you know, I think, darn it, you know, I'm going to do better tomorrow, and I don't really think about it. But when you get an EEG and you can see they're slowing, and that may be a manifestation of days or weeks of poor sleep, it really implores you to make a change, right? And sometimes it just takes that before you take it more seriously. I hope that it didn't
Freak me out.
freak you out too much, because you know, I promise you, we see much worse than that. You're actually remarkably fit, and so you do have a beautiful brain image, and so I don't want that to be something where you leave here like, oh my God. But yeah, all of us have room for improvement, especially, you know, myself and even some of the most elite athletes that we see. You know, they can observe that there are changes that they need to make, and many times the behaviors that are needed are difficult for people to adopt. You know, in some cases it may be, I need to stop drinking as much as I am, or I need to sleep at an earlier hour, or I need to make smarter food choices. You know, these are all difficult things to do. But now having tools that can reinforce that, you know, the changes I am making are positively impacting my brain health, or I need to do better than what I'm doing right now. I think that's part of the power of the technology, is to give you a baseline and to be able to measure longitudinal change over time.
Your colleague was telling me when she did hers, it just more kind of made her feel comfortable about some of the things that she knew, like she used to get anxiety and things, and she said that it just made her comfortable to know what it was, and when it came, she felt as though, okay, well that's kind of like how things are, and I can deal with it, and I can balance it, and I can prevent putting myself in those situations. And I think when I saw my one, you talked about, you know, there was two sides of it. One was that, you know, you're very driven, and which is the positive, but on the negative, you could have issues of not sleeping, and it keeps you awake, and you know, you just obsess about something. And I think knowing that and being able to see that it's been ignored. You know, before I used to just think, well, what's going on? You know, is this normal? Isn't it? You know, you almost get anxious about what's going on. But I think knowing that there's a kind of a positive and a negative, maybe me being able to sort of accept that, okay, well, I've got this positive thing going on, which I need to appreciate, but I also need to kind of be able to control what could, you know, the other side, you know, and think about, you know, some of the actions I can maybe take to, you know, maybe don't drink coffee in the day when you are anxious or whatever. There's probably some behaviors that I think can almost make you feel a little bit more comfortable when you have that awareness of probably what's going on. Well, it certainly made me feel a little bit better.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's true to life too. You know, too much of anything can be harmful, right? Like too much water can result in some electrolyte abnormalities. Too much sunlight can result in skin cancer. And so, you know, we always have to achieve some kind of balance. But yeah, what are some of the most positive strengths can turn into weaknesses in excess. And so, you know, the specific area we're talking about, beta, it's a signal for people who tend to be very successful. There's a lot of grit, a lot of resilience associated with that. But you know, too much can lead to some profound anxiety, as we had discussed. And so I think just having that knowledge allows there to be a certain amount of self-empathy and awareness, where when those things start to emerge, it's like, okay, this is just part of my profile, it's okay. You know, that's certainly the way that we've observed this amongst ourselves. Just having that knowledge and insight gives us some power to change and to improve our lives.
You touched on it earlier, and I wanted to sort of go into it a little bit more detail. Alcohol and drugs. What does that do that you can, if I assume that people have sort of tested that when they've had alcohol or had some kind of drugs. What kind of impact does that have on whether it's temporary or permanent on things like your brain waves?
That's a great question. And so broadly categorized, we sort of look at pharmaceuticals or even nutraceuticals and supplements that, some are depressants and some are stimulants, and alcohol is one of these depressants. And we do see slowing of neurons over time, depending on how much is consumed. And so a glass of wine is not going to hurt most people, but a lot of hard drinking over time can cause significant slowing in neurons. And beyond just the alcohol itself, alcohol can be one of the most disruptive agents to sleep that we have. And this is something that's shown up in all kinds of research, is when we talk about destroying sleep architecture, alcohol is really one of the bad actors that is implicated. And so I know that makes me very unpopular, but I don't intend to be a killjoy. But if we're trying to protect our sleep, there are very few things I can think of that are more harmful than alcohol. And so we just have to be thoughtful about using alcohol, how much we're consuming, and how many days consecutively that might be, because you're likely disrupting your sleep quality. And over weeks, months, or years, cumulatively, that can have a pretty harmful effect.
And what about, without sort of saying anything too controversial, but if people are taking, I guess, medical drugs for depression, anxiety, and things like that, like have you seen that whilst they could maybe sort of solve one part of it, do you see that could also disrupt some of the functioning of the brain because you're taking those sorts of drugs, whether on sleep or just on how your brain fires?
Yeah, and so there's many different medications and pharmaceuticals to talk about, but specific to the sleep drugs like Zolpidem, the brand name is Ambien, Sonata. These are called hypnotic medications. They are good at helping people with sleep latency, meaning it'll help you to fall asleep. But they're not as good in terms of your sleep architecture, getting you to the deeper stages of sleep that are more restorative. Sleep is its own form of emotional convalescence, particularly in the REM stages and the non-REM deep stages of sleep. And if you're not able to get as much of time in those stages of sleep, we tend to sabotage ourselves just a little bit or fool ourselves into thinking, I got a full night of sleep, when in fact you may not have been getting as much restorative sleep as you need. And so I think there's now emerging evidence that some of these medications may not be as helpful as we would like. I think in the short term, in terms of establishing a cadence and getting yourself to sleep at the right time and waking up at the right time, used properly, they can be of benefit. But I think long-term chronic use, that may not be in our best interest. And some of the other medications, whether antidepressants or benzodiazepines, those come with their own problems. And we just have to be diligent about making sure we're taking them for the right reasons and that the benefit outweighs the risks. Those are all conversations to have with everyone's individual doctors. But we shouldn't underestimate the power of those medications on brain function.
But potentially, like your colleague says, maybe even when you're younger, like I was thinking about my children, but getting a baseline scan. So whatever you do, whether it's some sort of treatment or medicine or whatever, seeing what it was like before and then assessing it will give you a good idea of whether something you're doing is helping or not. Would probably be good, advisable, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And I encourage everyone to get a baseline scan, and all of my children have had one. The way we're doing it and the reports we generated are a little bit unique. And so if people are interested, we have close to 70 centers around the country. They can walk in and get one. It's a quick 15-minute scan, and it gives people very useful, actionable information. And so I do think in the future state, we would love to see this. It should be part of everyone's annual physical exam. But making this accessible kind of on a walk-in basis, I think would inform so many other useful conversations. And, we had talked earlier, I've had friends who are very good at hiding or masking some of their struggles and their symptoms. And sometimes on the EEG, we can see that and have an honest conversation and get people, in some instances, the help that they need. Or in other cases, reaffirm that, wow, you've got a very high-functioning brain. And so it's just, it's useful data and information for everyone to learn about themselves, where they are, and maybe years down the road, that could be important information as well.
One of the things that we were also mentioning was people have been through this pandemic and they've been locked in, and there's a lot of mental health issues that people have. Obviously, for they've probably had family problems and money problems and health issues, and that seems to be taking a toll on a lot of people. So if somebody is going through that, mental depression, can you spot that from doing a scan then?
Yeah, so the EEGs have become, the research is telling us they're north of, depending on what study you look at, 80 to 90% sensitive at picking up major depression. It's pretty good at picking up a number of other conditions as well. There's good studies with ADD, TBI. There's a product called the Brain Scope where they can detect traumatic brain injuries and concussions. And so it's a very useful tool to identify that. And it's something that it's very simple and easy, non-invasive to obtain. These days you can get it, some people may be familiar, the EEGs they use for seizure detection. There's a bunch of gel that gets in their hair or their scalp, and the new dry lead EEGs, that's not necessary. It's kind of a very simple and elegant way of capturing a brain image. But to answer your question, yeah, they're pretty useful at identifying those types of issues, and usually people will recognize or know, okay, there is something here, and I think in the future that'll be an adjunct to the clinical armamentarium that'll be very useful for clinicians and teams to be utilizing.
In terms of optimizing then, so you've had your scans and there's a few things that you've got, whether you want to improve your reaction or you just want to be a little bit sharper or improve your sleep. So once you've had this scan, then one of the things that you do in your clinic is you've got this sort of this device. There looks like there's a home one, there's a mini one, and then there's a big one that you can, within a band, you can improve things. So talk about how you take that and you can sort of make some slight tweaks to improve your mental function.
So much in the same way, in terms of race car driving, a lot of the technology that's innovated in Formula One race car driving is filtered into commercial vehicles. We've taken FDA grade, medical quality, medical grade technology, and we've innovated, recognizing that this needs to be more accessible to populations, a much lower energy device, and one that's very portable. And so we can utilize this as a wellness device that's much more within reach for people. And that's something we've innovated and are going to go into production later this year. And we're looking towards a lot of the customers that are very interested in this, beyond the people that you would expect, like elite athletes and executives. But a lot of gyms and these human performance centers are starting to adopt not just the EEG, but these stimulation devices for a variety of different reasons. So it's exciting to see the different applications and uses for something like this. And I think in the next 5 to 10 years, we're going to see a lot of innovation and adoption in this area.
And the ones that you have in your centers, then they have the ability to align the electrical sort of function of your brain, so that it's kind of they're firing and connected in the way they should be. On that scan, you sort of said that the front part of your brain and the back part, sometimes they they're not sort of firing exactly the same way, and some of this stimulation you give can assist to kind of get that working harmoniously.
That's exactly right. That's our objective. And it doesn't require a lot of energy. So if there's any concerns, some people may have images of electroconvulsive therapy, this shock therapy. This is nothing like this. It's a very gentle and mild stimulation. And a lot of our people say it's a very pleasant, some people call it a brain massage. But the overarching goal and objective is to allow these neurons to fire more coherently and synchronously. And we've seen some really promising data start to emerge, even using very low energy types of technologies. And that's really something we're at the forefront of.
Mm. And if I was to come into your center in Newport, then what you would do is I would have this to try and get me up to from 9.1 to 10. Then I would have a treatment of this with this device, and it would sort of over a period of time it would just try and kind of trigger some of my electrical things that are going on in my head. Then would it?
Yeah. It would. The goal would be to.
I want a 10.
Yeah. So ultimately, what we'd be trying to achieve in your case is, there wasn't a ton of room for improvement in your EEG, but we'd want to improve the alignment of the different regions of the brain just a little bit.
Right. So just as we wrap up, because this is a fascinating subject for me, I've learned so much here. But one of the things I've always wondered about, and I've read a lot previously, is that you have, and I don't know if this is the best way to describe it, but sometimes when you kind of have your brain, say for example, you have certain types of like thought patterns that may be positive or negative, and you have these kind of connections that are created in your brain. Is that, if I'm trying to sort of imagine what's going on, is some of that to do with like and I learned about it when I was listening to one of your interviews, like where you're trying to get your brain to sort of fully connect and fire, but if you're, say for example, you're creating these, like when you're learning something, for example, that's probably a better explanation. So if you're trying to learn to write, are you creating connections in the brain that when you're learning a new skill? But if your brain's firing correctly, then making those connections is very, very easily. Whereas if it's not performing correctly when you're trying to learn a new skill, like you mentioned, the sort of piano, can that take longer and until you've sort of got everything working right? Does that question make sense to you?
Yeah. This is an area, and so there is a paradigm in neuroscience called Hebbian learning, which the easiest way to remember it is they say as neurons fire, they wire.
Okay.
And so there's neural pathways that start to establish, and when you talk about, sometimes I get in a loop of a negative thought or a positive thought, largely that may be kind of pre-wiring that may exist from childhood or earlier in life. And when we learn something new, when we get into a task acquisition mode, we can access new areas of the brain. And so this is what we call plasticity. And part of the beauty of kind of where we are is there's no reason why we can't re-engage that as we get older. This philosophy, it's hard to teach an old dog new tricks, I completely disagree with. There's no reason why we can't learn new things, learn a new musical instrument, read a book, try to learn a new language. All these things are really positive. Even something as simple as, we used to have a Navy SEAL here who got really into juggling. He talked about bihemispheric connection, and he wanted to learn to juggle. And he got really good at it in a very short amount of time. And he was somebody who was a bit older. And so I just encourage everyone, if they feel like they're in a rut, learning something new, acquiring a new skill is a beautiful way to engage new neuronal activity. And this philosophy of Hebbian learning starts to get engaged, where you start accessing new areas of the brain. And in terms of how that relates to our technology, there's new emerging thoughts about neuropriming, that as you cause some stimulation to neurons, they're more receptive to new feedback. And so I think that we're sort of in a paradigm where we're looking at specific indications. How does this technology help diagnose X, Y, and Z? But as we're starting to move into this human performance space, I think there will be applications towards perhaps creativity or task acquisition and learning. These are all areas that are not strictly in the medical domain, but are in more of this human performance optimization domain. And I think that these vectors are starting to converge. And as more research and publications come out towards that end, I think the sky's the limit in terms of what can be achieved.
Because I wonder whether it will be like, you go and have a massage, whether almost in some ways it's just there's a bit of a brain health that you do once a month where you just kind of go and have that light massage and it just kind of keeps everything, do you know what I mean? I don't know, mate. It sounds like that could be a good thing to do maybe, particularly as you age.
Yeah. And as this whole science around longevity, and we're kind of qualifying these now as people that focused on lifespan, like how long we can live, the centenarians, people who live to 100, and there's now more discussion about health span. How long can we remain vibrant and healthy and active? And ultimately, I think that's the goal that we're all striving for. And this, I believe, will become part of that discussion in terms of how do we maintain or even grow in terms of what we can learn, what we can achieve as we age. I think the confines that maybe imagined may just be self-imposed limitations, and it's exciting to see where we can go in the future.
So my last question, and you've queued that up perfectly, is escape your limits is about escaping what you've believed is impossible and gone on to make possible. What would be a memorable example of escaping your own personal limits?
That's a great question. It's funny, and it may just be because we're recording a podcast. A few years ago, I was very uncomfortable, with these public speaking engagements and talking in front of a camera. And it's something that I've learned to be comfortable with. And, a lot of it is just due to repetitions. For me, part of the reason to push through was just mission and purpose. I felt like this message was really important to get out there. And perhaps for the audience, especially kind of coming out of the pandemic where we've been sort of in this imposed isolation, from a neuroscience and innovation and technology perspective, there's never been a greater time for hope and optimism that there's these real breakthroughs in ways that we can empower ourselves to achieve new things and acquire new knowledge. It's really an exciting time to be alive, and there's so many fascinating things happening. And selfishly, I think neuroscience and what we're doing is an amazing thing to dive into. But everyone in the audience may have a different passion, and just engaging in those, learning and growing in new ways is part of what makes this life and this world so fascinating. And I hope everyone kind of walks away from this with some excitement of there's so much more to discover and learn. And part of that is just even from a science and research perspective, there's new discoveries almost on a daily and weekly basis. And so I hope everyone will continue to stay on that path. And my information can be included in the show notes. I'm happy to speak to anyone who's interested in talking and learning about our field. And just appreciate the time we got to spend together.
Thanks. Well, Dr. Erik, thank you very much for your time. Appreciate it.
Yeah,
thank you.
Absolutely.
That's great. Hey, I hope you enjoyed this podcast. If you did, then please go over to iTunes and subscribe to the Escape Your Limits podcast. Leave a review, leave a comment. It really would help us a lot to continue to keep these going.